Hey everyone. For those of us who are just joining, we have a few folks still in the waiting room. We have a lot of people registered for this webinar, so we're going to give it a few minutes to try to get everybody in before we start talking. So we'll be started in a few minutes. Hey everyone, we're going to get started in just a couple minutes, just waiting for a few more folks to join. We saw some people in the waiting room trying to get in.
I can't get the Zoom thing to work on my iPad.
Nope, it's working.
No.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're so happy that so many of you have chosen to join us. We have about 270 people or 60 people on right now. So we're going to get started just so that we can, get this conversation started and really use the time we have together to get into some real conversation about what folks can do and how you can get plugged in. I am Ameca. I'm the membership director here at Law for Black Lives, and I have the pleasure of facilitating this conversation tonight. We are recording, for those of you who have asked in the chat box, we are recording this webinar, and we'll make it available, as we do most of our webinars, to our website, and we'll also send it out with some resources after the webinar. So if you have to drop off, or if for some reason you know someone who couldn't attend, it will be available for you later. I do want to just remind folks, since this is such a big group of people, and we'll have people coming in probably for the first 20 minutes or so, and folks will probably drop out, we are asking that you mute yourselves. And if you are on your computer, at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there's a little microphone. If you press that, it will mute you. And so we can't hear you. Sometimes even the smallest or slightest noise can create a lot of distraction, and folks can hear it really a lot louder than you think they might be able to. So please mute yourself. If you are on the phone, if you dialed in from the phone, you will likely be muted already. If at any point we call for folks to, provide input or do questions in person, then you can unmute yourself by *6, or if you're on the computer, you can unmute yourself by, I'm sorry, my dogs are barking in the background. You can unmute yourself by pressing the little microphone in the corner. The other thing I will say is that with this many people, it will be hard to take questions from folks individually. And so when we call for questions, we'll likely call for them in the chat box. You can put your question in the chat box, and then we will be able to pull it up from there. Also, throughout the webinar, we'll be asking for folks to chime in. So we'll please put thoughts and questions and comments in the chat box. Okay, so without further ado, I'm gonna just turn it over to our panelists. I do want to just intro this webinar by letting folks know sort of what to expect from this conversation. We have been watching, just like many of you have been watching across the country, really over the past couple months, how folks have really been experiencing a range of emotions, grief, anger, really not only at the police violence that folks in our communities continue to experience, but also really the lack of accountability and really the lack of response by our local, state, and federal governments to meet the demands of folks. And then you put that on the backdrop of a global pandemic and how people are feeling, and it really has sort of bubbled up into ways that I happen to think are, quite beautiful. People are taking to the streets. People are rising up and demanding resources and action that are more consistent with the kinds of things that our communities think keep us safe, and to not rely on police, and to take police out of the equation. And this really I think feels good, but for some of us, and probably many of you on the call, this really also feels like a moment where you want to help, you want to loan your skills and your expertise to movements, and it's hard to know sometimes where to plug in or even how to do that in the right way. And we have assembled a really dope panel for you today, so that you can hopefully learn from them or be inspired by some of the conversation that we have to plug in on the local level. I know many folks feel really drawn to help where it seems like your help is most needed. And sometimes these bigger national fights are where we feel most called to plug in. But also there may be stuff in your own city or in your own town that you could actually get plugged into and your resources can be used for. So today the conversation is really going to talk about, what other people are doing around the country, and what are some ways that lawyers and legal workers can get plugged in. So with that said, I'm first going to just turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves by just name, location, and pronoun, where you're calling from, and then we'll get the conversation started.
Hey everybody, my name is Tiffany Roberts. I am calling in from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm I use she, her pronouns, and I work at the Southern Center for Human Rights.
Thanks, Tiffany.
Hey everyone, Iman Freeman, she, her, hers. I'm with Baltimore Action Legal Team.
Hey everyone, this is Amna Akbar, comfortable with any pronouns. I live in Columbus, Ohio. I work with the National Lawyers Guild, Columbus and Ohio. And I'm also on the board for Law for Black Lives and the Center for Constitutional Rights.
All right, y'all. Thank you. And I'm also just so grateful that you all joined us and are going to offer your brilliance to us, especially on such short notice. So first, I want to just open up the conversation to, well, first I want to note that we'll have a panelist joining us in about 15 minutes, and we'll stop for a moment to bring him into the conversation, and then we'll resume our conversation. So there'll be a slight interruption. But I just would be interested in hearing, and I'm sure folks on the call would be interested in hearing from you, Iman, Tiffany, and Amna about what kinds of things, like just giving us a sort of description of what you're seeing where you are with respect to uprisings and the response and what folks are experiencing.
I can start. So what we're seeing in Atlanta play out is a little different than what we're accustomed to. So there are a lot of direct actions that happen in Atlanta, but this is the most militarized response we've seen to demonstrations. Seeing a lot of, so we saw for the first time rubber bullets and tear gas, which we hadn't experienced. And there were far more arrests than is typical. So I think right now we're dealing with somewhere between like 450 to 550 people who were arrested from the, 2 Fridays ago through last Friday. I think there were no arrests over the weekend. We had a curfew for several days, which resulted in a ton of curfew violations, and the National Guard was called in, which presented its own set of issues because there are already like 23, I think, arresting agencies that feed into our county jail. So adding sort of like the militarized response from the National Guard to that equation meant that there were a lot of people sort of rounded up right around curfew and thrown into jail. We have a mix of far more felonies than we're used to seeing. Typically, Southern Center will support a couple of movement lawyers who want to organize the response, the courtroom response to the arrest. And this go round, we had a group of private lawyers get together during some of the uprisings here and form a group to also respond by providing pro bono legal representation. So we've had like an interesting mix of people who have typically represented folks in movement and people who are, coming into this work without much training or experience with dealing with people on the ground. And so finding a balance there and finding ways to ensure that we can protect our folks from maybe people who don't understand the politic involved. We're under a judicial state of emergency still, I think until the end of this month, it's June. We're not expected to have trials until the top of 2021, from what I understand. And most of the people who were arrested over the last 2 weeks won't be back in court at least until September. So it's been, this go round has been really different for a lot of reasons. And we're finding that access to people we need to help in the jails is a big problem because of the pandemic. And then kind of like nailing down folks to be helpful is hard because we can't tell them when we'll need them really precisely.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Hey, this is Iman. I guess I'll go next. So what are we seeing? Are you asking, is the question, I start my video, is the question specific to the direct actions as a result of George Floyd's murder, or is it just levels, because we started with COVID seeing some crazy things? So what's the scope of the question?
Give us the highest level, and I think as we move
Okay.
into the conversation, we'll start to drill down on some of the more specific things.
Yeah. So, you know, the crazy thing is, while Tiffany was talking, so in Baltimore, we've had a lot of direct action. Surprisingly, the police are not engaging. They are they're like either in like they're like on side streets. They really are not, let me say this, in the beginning of the day, they are really not engaging. It's weird. So all of the LOs I've talked to and Baltimore Vault, we do the 24/7 jail support hotline. So we've seen a lot of, you know, we really don't see anyone. We don't see police, or they're not very visible. There's a lot of aerial surveillance just in Baltimore, period, but especially like the route that, you know, the activists may take. There's always something overhead. We do notice in a lot of the LOs and a lot of the people that call into the hotline, they've said that as the night goes on, the police, they do get more aggressive. And so maybe starting around 11 or 12, that's when they start to get aggressive. That's when you hear your orders of dispersal. That's when you see more, you know, a show of aggression. But in the daytime, we don't see that. We've had very few arrests. We did have one arrest. Not as much, like I said, like I'm comparing maybe to other cities, and I'm also comparing to what we went through right in 2015, which is a stark difference. And we're still trying to make sense of it, largely, but as far as direct actions and just police presence, it's definitely been not much interaction from the police, and not your typical showing, but a lot of aerial surveillance, a lot of eyes in the sky.
Hey everyone. So from Columbus, Ohio, I mean, we're seeing a lot of the things that Tiffany and Iman talked about. We're seeing both planned protests and actions connected to movement organizations and racial justice organizers, and organic kind of uprising happening all over the city. We're in a little bit of a rest phase, I think, right now, but I expect we will be back in a more robust phase of protest starting on Thursday. We are, of course, seeing all over the slogans and placards that people are bringing to the protests, a real shift in demands away from where we were in 2014 and 2015, reflecting a growing abolitionist ethic in terms of a critique of police being fundamental and a call to defund, disband, and abolish. The police presence has changed day to day, starting very heavy. Well, it's been heavy every day, but in terms of overt forms of violence, like the use of pepper spray and chemical agents, rubber bullets, wood pellets, and so on. That was very intense the first weekend, and now they are still brutalizing and arresting protesters, but a little bit more selectively. They are present, of course, we know, in visible and invisible ways. We're starting to hear about door knocks from the feds in other parts of the state, right-wing trolls and infiltration on our jail support hotline, and a curfew that was just lifted on Saturday that is kind of changing the dynamics of legal support as well as protest. The other really beautiful thing that's shifted since 2014 and 2015 is that we have new infrastructure, both locally and in the state, to support protest, uprising, and rebellion. We have community bail funds. We have a National Lawyers Guild chapter that's much more organized than it was back then all over the state. We have law students who are kind of coming into being socialized as lawyers with a more radical critique of systems of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy in ways that are allowing them to show up in ways that are super beautiful. Because the protests have gone on from day to day, day after day and don't have a clear start and beginning. We also have these beautiful kind of chains of mutual aid developing in the state that are important to the protest and uprising kind of being sustained. So we have medics and we have supply chains and different kinds of mutual aid sort of support for people taking the streets. So that's kind of the overview from Columbus.
Thank you, Amna. I think with that, it might be, I hear a few different like themes coming up, but before we touch on those, I think it might be interesting for folks on the call to hear, because the three of you have, a lot of experience both in previous years where there have been uprisings and also now, but it might be interesting just to hear some of the ways that you're supporting in your individual roles, either in your professional, like, job on paper, or in your life as like a member of the community that you live in, who also happens to have the skills and the background that you have. But just wanting to hear from you all, like, what role are you playing right now, or what ways are you offering your support to folks either where you are or even outside, maybe even nationally?
I'll go first since Tiffany went first last time. So BALT, we have a bail fund. So we are posting bail. And the reason why I asked you was this, can we kind of talk about how, we had COVID and then this, is because what we saw out of COVID was the increased use of electronic monitoring, and that's what we're continuing to see. And we've offered to pay the fees against, like, we are completely against, like, expanding the carceral state. Like, we struggled, right? But when we started to receive calls from, especially a lot of attorneys that represent youth, saying, look, my client is being given the choice: go to jail during a pandemic or pay for home monitoring. And we made the decision at the moment, in this very immediate moment, to address the immediate need of folks. So we have a bail fund. We have in our home monitoring program called Cells to Safety. So we have that. And we're also right now trying to get some transparency over, I'm not sure if you all have seen the viral video of Miss Sharnifa Street, who was hit by the Baltimore police officer. So we're trying to get some transparency as to why charges weren't brought. And, we're working to, like I said, while we're paying for a lot of home monitoring fees, we're also working to bring awareness to the fact that we probably see this as the future. And I think we don't want just the increased use of home monitoring to be the answer, because it's not. And so we're trying to increase awareness to that. And just in addition, we have our, like I said, 24/7 jail support hotline. We partner with NLG for legal observing, and we partner with Baltimore Jail Support to support folks as they come out, as they're released. And then we partner with a lot of community organizations to also offer wraparound services. And if they need housing, if they need other things, we'll partner with organizations to help with that.
Okay, so I can share a little bit about, I forgot to mention sort of like the different organizations that have been involved in some of this response. And like Iman mentioned, we were already sort of in the thick of trying to get people out of jail because of COVID. We have some really dilapidated jails in Georgia, so it was even more pressing than it would otherwise be. So there were already like formations of people who are working like across organizations to get folks out, and that same group of people became sort of like the core of the response to uprisings around these killings. We had the Arbery killing in Brunswick, Georgia, which was state-sanctioned violence, but it wasn't a killing by a police officer, even though one of the killers was a DA investigator, which is sort of like a law enforcement officer. So the NAACP of Georgia was the organization who was on the ground with the family in Brunswick. And so we convened a group called Just Georgia to work specifically around the issues stemming from that case. And we've been trying to shift the narrative a bit to talk about the overall criminalization of Black people in Georgia, so that we don't limit ourselves to sort of like get pigeonholed into talking about hate crimes legislation, but to think about the issue more broadly. And we support some work by some of our comrades at Women on the Rise. So there was already a campaign to shut down the city jail. And the sort of abolitionist narrative or the abolitionist framework was already sort of moving in Atlanta. And so as a part of supporting, again, like the decriminalization of race, we've been more vocal about the support of some really pressing budgetary issues around the city jail here in Atlanta. And I think Women on the Rise and Song got together and did an action even today to divert funds. So the jail is closing, but there is still like $18 million allocated for the jail in this year's budget. And so Song supported Women on the Rise and doing a direct action about that today. And then we also, the Mama Fund, so Metro Atlanta Mutual Aid, I want to say they provided, over $100,000 worth of rapid response aid to marginalized people here in Atlanta around COVID. And so trying to find those connections between people who have been arrested and people who also have some emergency needs to be met. Mama Fund is really active around that. And because of Obama's speech the other day, the mayor stood up a task force on use of force, and it's like a 30-person task force to make some recommendations around use of force. And so what we're hoping is that this will become, again, a broader conversation, not about like police training, but actually the violent culture of policing and the need for there to be a divestment from police and an investment in community. And I feel like I'm forgetting something. Am I forgetting something, Ameca?
I don't think so, but you can always chime back in if you
Okay.
remember. It's cool. Thank you. Amna,
Yeah, sorry, I got cut. It froze for a minute, so I had to cut and come back. But we're talking about how we're showing up, basically what our role is locally. Yeah, I mean, so we have a National Lawyers Guild chapter here, which has been active-ish, but fledgling since about 2014. And so I have been showing up, to do all the different kinds of legal support that guild chapters do, and trying to work with other people to build out or expand or deepen systems that we don't yet have or are not sophisticated enough. So some of that is legal observing and jail support and jail visits. Some of it is about building out our mass defense infrastructure. So working with criminal defense attorneys, we're having something I think that's happening all over the country, where a lot of lawyers are posting on their social media willingness to take on cases for free or low cost. So we're trying to kind of keep track of those and talk to those folks to figure out what they're about, because the motivations to do that can be multifold. And free or low bono legal services can be good for our movements and our people, but we need to make sure people have some understanding, at least if not a shared politics and commitment, and obviously a prioritization of Black and brown lawyers to the extent that that's important to the people who are getting arrested and the organizations and the organizers we're working with. And so we're also coordinating with statewide. So we have like the Ohio Guild is organized actually at the state level, and then we have like these local kind of configurations. And so the statewide folks are talking to kind of share notes and build out what we can at the statewide level, so that we don't have to rebuild everything at the local level. So for example, we now have a statewide arrest hotline, because that's something that can be, that makes sense to be run as a whole state. And we have a system of jail support kind of functioning through that hotline. I've spent the time that I can talking to organizers. So a lot of the people on the streets are obviously not connected to left social movement organizations or racial justice organizations. But to the extent that, there are people in our communities who are, that we have pre-existing relationships to, talking to those people to see what's needed, how we can support. And then, nationally, just talking to friends and comrades in other cities who have done this kind of support in other contexts, just to share notes and think about, and doing some of this statewide too, thinking about what kind of trainings and what kind of political education we need to be doing for lawyers and law students right now, so that people are, ready to meet the moment.
Thank you. So I believe that Lumumba Bandele has joined us. And I just want to take a moment to bring you into the conversation. Thank you for being here. We're just introducing ourselves, name, pronoun, any org that you want to rep, and then just give us a sort of like picture of what you are seeing in your work, either in New York or nationally, that you want to raise up in this conversation.
Sure. Good evening. I'm assuming everybody's on the East Coast. If not, good evening or afternoon. It's always an honor to be in the presence of the Law for Black Lives folks. We need you. So I'm always honored to be in your presence. Lumumba Bandele, pronouns he, him, his. I am the National Strategies and Partnerships Director at the Movement for Black Lives, also a member of the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement and the former Director of Organizing at the Legal Defense Fund. So what are we seeing on the ground? I can briefly talk about a national scope, and then I can talk a little bit about some local stuff here in New York, which I think is significant to raise. Nationally, I think we're seeing a trend of activism and I think direct action in the streets that oftentimes, particularly to communities of color, let me speak specifically to Black folks, particularly folks who are not attached to any particular organizing, are trying to make sense of. What does that mean? We are looking at a very significant influx of primarily white folks who are coming into communities doing some high-level actions, and folks are not necessarily sure who they are. So there's a whole gamut that people are trying to put them in terms of buckets, but I think there are mainly three significant buckets. There, one, that they are possibly far-right operatives who are literally trying to, take our lives and are in opposition of us living our life. It could be just organized, folks who are trying to have a presence, and then some other folks think it may also be, well, let me say this, sorry. It may be some organized folks who are from some other kind of left formations, who we are not necessarily in direct communication with. And then the other is that it's possibly law enforcement operatives. I think the first and the third oftentimes work in tandem. And so we, aren't necessarily able to make a distinction between the two. So I think there's that. But what we're seeing also simultaneously to that, as we saw both with Ferguson, with Baltimore, is that the people of our folks that are in the streets are regular folks. Like, this is a shift from movement people. They're being led, I think, primarily by people who are organized. I think the infrastructure in many cities and locations were set for people to come in, to pick up language, to pick up political narrative, to pick up an organizational vehicle to carry out much of what people are demanding and talking about in the streets now. But the majority of people in the streets are our neighbors, are our cousins, our friends, our teachers, our students, people who have just simply said enough. And so for us, this is a prayer answered. Our organizing spaces have always said we need to get more of our folks involved. We need to how do we do that? How do we do that? Well, we got our prayers answered, right? And so we really have to make sure that we are being responsible with how we move people, right? And that means that we are providing clarity that we are providing political direction, we're providing space for political growth. That means that we are providing protection and a number of other things. But I think we recognize that we are in a moment where we have to be responsible, because what we don't want this to be is an episodic kind of thing. We want to be able to hold the people who are engaged right now to a level of engagement that is sustainable. You know, we want to be able to make sure folks who are going out day in, day in, day in to do protests, good, you know, but let's introduce you to other tactics of movement that is not rooted specifically in protesting, right? What are other things that you can do that can contribute to this broader freedom movement? So those are some of the things that I think we're seeing locally. Last night, yesterday evening rather, there was a mobilization primarily coordinated by families of people who have been killed by the police with the support of the Justice Committee that marched from City Hall in Lower Manhattan to Union Square. What we have seen in that particular action was interesting in that I imagine that we will see it across the country, if we haven't started to see it, is an increase in privatization of security. Right. Because of some of the things that happened in Soho, many of the businesses up and down Broadway hired private security. When I engaged some of them before the march, just trying to figure out who these people were, many of them are off-duty law enforcement. And so it's important for us to recognize that, as particularly as the narrative that we're pushing around defund police, around abolishing police, that we have to be clear about what it is we want in replace of that. We have to make sure that we have a flip of what we want investment in. We have to have a real clear analysis on what the society, the environment that we want to create actually looks like. We don't want to replace one state-sanctioned militarized force with a private one, right? And so it's important that we make those distinctions and be clear about what that looks like, because it'll be very, very easy for us to just turn around and we have a number of private, separate, uncoordinated kinds of militarized forces in our streets. And so I'll stop there because I know I'm probably talking too much, but there are things that I'll share a little bit later.
Thank you so much. That was great. And I think that really ties into what some of the other panelists have lifted up already. And I feel like there are some things, sort of like some sort of themes that are like percolating from all of the panelists. And I'll just sort of name them and then invite folks to dig deeper a little bit on that, like a particular challenge and some of the ways that you and folks around you are trying to address it. So some of the things I heard were really about the like sort of intersection between the response to COVID-19 and then having the sort of response to the uprisings kind of collapse into each other, and what you're doing to really respond to both in the moment. And then there's this other question about increased surveillance, and also even, I would add to that, privatization of security or police forces, and the potential that we could pull, sort of win on some of the demands to defund the police, but then push us towards a more privatized kind of a system. And then the other thing I heard all of you sort of lift up is this like energy around like folks who wouldn't normally have come out into the streets or stepped up in this moment. So folks who maybe don't have a political home or are not connected to organizing, who have energy and want to be directed, and what are some of the, or want to help, and what are some of the challenges around that, and what are you like, how are you trying to meet that challenge? So I'll open it to either Iman, Amna, Tiffany, or Lumumba to grab onto any of those, or even one that I didn't mention that you're really grappling with that you want to sort of lift up.
I can start this time. I mean, so just kind of tying some of those things together. I mean, I think one of the things that we have seen, you know, through the course of history is that in moments like this, you know, a lot of people, like Lumumba were saying, are kind of ready to do more and, you know, and might be ready to join, you know, our movements and our organizations in different ways, and are looking for ways to plug in. And so from the perspective of the statewide guilds, in Ohio, we are having a lot of lawyers and law students, and probably some, general professional managerial class types who want to kind of plug in to do legal support, as, sometimes as legal observers, sometimes at jail support hotlines, so they could do it from home. And like, because there's such a kind of huge need, and we have this unique issue of a lot of people doing the work, right? There's always a lot of work, but normally the question is, how do we get people to do it? And now there's, so many people who want to step in. And so and we're building the infrastructure kind of as we're doing the work. And so that is a hard balance to then try to figure out how to integrate people. A lot of what we know about community organizing is that it's focused on relationship building, and that building our movements in our communities requires kind of building slow, getting to know one another, and that sort of thing. And yet it's important to create pathways for new people to step into the work, in part because we know and we learn from, for example, Mary Hooks, that like when you, the mandate for Black people, one of the parts in that that's really important is this idea of being transformed in service of the work. And so we know that when people throw down with movements and organizing and uprisings, there's a way that their sense of what's possible, of who they are, what they're willing to prioritize can shift. And so trying to create different ways for people to kind of show up for the work is really important. So how to kind of like balance the building infrastructure as we're doing, creating space for new people. And when we're talking about the Guild, we're talking about a lot of white people and non-Black people of color, and then thinking about the relationship building piece, the security and infiltration issues that Lumumba was raising, the fact that a lot of this has to happen by Zoom, all of those things are, a lot to balance. And so we have been, and then also, I guess, thinking about the sustainability piece, like how do we make the work of the people who are on, doing the work every day sustainable? How do we welcome the new interest in a way that's sustainable, and we invite people to make a commitment that's more long-term? One of the things I just wanted to name that I forgot to before is like, there's all these kind of like mass defense kinds of things that lawyers do, but there's also right now all over the country, we have these defund the police campaigns either going or brewing. And one of the things that lawyers, legal workers, law students can help with, if it's something that local organizers would find useful, right, is to start to understand city budgets and the role and proportion of police. And the Movement for Black Lives has created a number of tools to figure out, what's going on in other cities and how to do it in your own cities. Law for Black Lives has also done that with M4BL. And we know that one of the things that makes budget fights hard is that they're endlessly technocratic. The information is not transparent. And so it's a kind of work that, you could both, that you could basically have people, lawyers in particular, and law students and legal workers step into at a time like this. So there's also that side of the work, which is preparing for, supporting the campaigns that are coming out of this uprising, and the Movement for Black Lives is obviously providing vision and direction for that. And then those campaigns are kind of taking root locally or deepening or expanding locally, depending on where they were before. So thinking about, as lawyers and legal workers, we can kind of provide, the skills, relationships that we have in solidarity to support the long-term transformative change requires all sorts of work beyond just mass defense.
Yeah, Amna, that's true. And I do want to get to like some of the other, like pick out some of the other things that lawyers can do. So thanks for raising that up.
So one thing that I can say is that if you're in a city where people appear to be energized around sort of this invest, divest, or abolitionist work, try to take some time to find the people who might have been working on that before 2014 to help you get a bit of perspective about sort of the political dynamics in wherever you're serving. Around 2015, a lot of younger people became engaged in some of the work and had demands that were wins that, this little scrappy political community organizing group that we had accomplished. Like these were wins from 2009 and 2010. But, you know, we probably hadn't done a good enough job of talking about those campaigns so that folks knew where we sat as a city. So some elders set up a meeting where organizers were able to talk to some of the older organizers were able to talk to some of the students about, you know, where exactly we were, because I think there's this tendency when an issue makes it to the national spotlight to presume that, like, okay, if those were the demands in Baltimore, then let's just leverage the Baltimore demands here, and they may not even be relevant. And so I think some intergenerational relationships could benefit folks who are newly coming into this work. An example in Atlanta has been, for a very long time, we've had to, you know, watch the budget and look at the amount of money that these different mayors would allocate to the police. And we had a deficit where the mayor before Mayor Bottoms, Kasim Reed, did a lot of stuff to try to balance the budget and create a surplus, included like cutting pensions, but also freezing raises and it had nothing to do with him divesting from police. He loved police. But the freezing of those wages then created this almost this imperative for the next mayor to promise to increase the police officer's salary. And so one of the first things that Mayor Bottoms did was she gave the police officers in Atlanta, I think it was reported as like the highest pay increase that they had received before, like historically. And some of us were kind of keeping an eye on that, but we had a hard time getting people to mobilize around it quickly because, you know, like Amna said, they'll drop a budget and you have so little time, like it's a 600-page document and you barely have any time to read it, to analyze the data, and to provide some alternatives. And it would have been helpful to have a bit more continuity between those of us who have been kind of watching it for years and trying to work around it for years, and some of the other folks who were able to do more rapid response work around budgets. An example of when it worked well was we found out that Fulton County, which is where Atlanta sits, planned to spend $23 million of COVID relief funds on a new isolation unit at the jail. So we have a county jail and then we have a city jail. So the city jail is what Women on the Rise is shutting down. But our county jail is two buildings. It's, you know, they have one for women and it's in sort of a suburb, and then they have the main jail. And the only reason we have two jails is because the jail is overcrowded. So there are people sleeping in boats in the atrium areas of the jail and that sort of thing. So found out about this $23 million just because someone we used to organize with had been paying attention to the agendas for another reason. And last week, community was able to basically flood the commission meeting with public comments about this allocation of funds. And what was interesting was the item it was taken off of the agenda because one of the commissioner who proposed it failed to upload like the most recent version of the bill or of the item. And so even though they took it off the agenda, community still stayed on the call to make public comment. And there were something like 40 comments and only one comment had nothing to do with opposing the allocation. And at the end of the meeting, instead of them putting it on the agenda for next week, they decided that they voted no further consideration of that allocation. And so it was, for us, it was a win for community groups overall, or grassroots organizers overall, because our jail, the sheriff is currently being sued by us for conditions that women with mental health disabilities are subjected to, has been under a consent decree before, is chronically overcrowded. He recently kicked the public defenders out of the jail after the public defenders filed a habeas petition on behalf of 200 some out of their clients who are being held there. They didn't have masks for people who are incarcerated in the month of March. And so there are all of these reasons that we could say, you know, commissioners always tell us they can't control what the jail does. When you come to them and say, hey, they're abusing people, they say, well, all we control is the budget. They're constitutional actors. We can't do anything about what the sheriff does at the jail. and then they want to turn around and give them $23 million. And what we said is, you're giving someone you can't control $23 million essentially to create a torture chamber at the jail. This unit, they said it was isolation unit to contain viruses. But after COVID passes, they're just going to use it as a solitary confinement unit, a solitary confinement add-on for an overcrowded jail. So they would rather put people in torture chambers than release them because of the pandemic. And so I think that, like, this conversation around money, I'm glad that more people are paying attention to it. And I wish that there was a way to do more effective rapid response around money, because it seems to be like one of the items that takes the longest to organize around, because it takes a second to wrap your head around it. And then it requires people with a specific skill set sometimes to actually put it in a format, or put the information in an accessible format so the community can use it.
Thank you, Tiffany. That is helpful, and also just an interesting look at how budgeting and how budgeting plays a role, and what folks should maybe be if you're plugging into something around defunding police, or even just around issues related to police and jails. The budget is actually a great place to start. I wonder if Iman and Lumumba, you can talk about like a particular challenge. Again, there are some themes here in our conversation about like the sort of collapsing of the COVID-19 response and the response to the uprisings, like sort of onto each other, and what folks have been doing to manage both of those at the same time. There are some specific challenges around surveillance, and again, around people plugging in who don't have a lot of direction or formal experience organizing.
So challenges. And okay, I want to.
Sorry to cut you off.
First. You go.
I just wanted to say, and like just lift up something that you're doing to like address it, because I think y'all have a bunch of different solutions, and I'd love to hear just some of the ways you're thinking about it too.
Okay. I want to first. I think I saw in the comments they asked, when I said that the police have been kind of not interacting as much, was that due to police reform? Hell no. No, and I'm sorry to say it like that, but that's what came to my mind. I think that the police, we've seen, right, a lot of the times that they're the first, that they start the aggression, right? You've seen where, I think that they realize that they start the aggression. I don't know what caused them to react the way they've been reacting the past couple of days in Baltimore, but it's definitely not due to police reform. I think one of the challenges that we've seen, and this is not necessary, I think this is COVID matched with what the recent direct actions, right? The courts are not operating normally right now, right? And so when you talk about, remember I talked to you all about, we're paying home monitoring fees for a lot of youth, some youth, mostly youth, but adults as well. People are, their first court date is not until September in a lot of cases, August a lot of cases. And so, that is a challenge in and of itself, right? Where, this may be our new normal, right? This may not be our new normal, but people are stuck, right, in the middle of all of this. I will say, even before this happened, we filed suit against the state's attorney's office, Baltimore Police Department, and Civilian Review Board to get some transparency around misconduct. Of course, that's something that we're seeing a push with for that now. But I'm sorry. So that was kind of I'm not sure if you want to call it solution, but that was something that BALT was doing, and that we're continuing now. But of course, because the courts are closed, they are prolonging everything. Let's see, another challenge that we see. I will say, and I think, and this is the COVID issue, there are people still in jail right now, right? no social distancing, no COVID tests, no adequate hygiene, none of that, right? And there's people right now in certain cities. We haven't seen an increased amount of arrests in Baltimore, but in a lot of cities, you're seeing people, then more people added to that in jail. Right now in jails, not necessarily prisons. So I think that all of the issues that we started to mobilize around due to COVID are being exacerbated due to, like in a lot of cities, more people coming in contact and more people being held in already unsanitary conditions. And, you know, despite America opening back up, it's still out here. So yeah, you know, as far as, you know, solutions, one thing I will say is that we're now, we have a coordinated Maryland justice call that we have. It used to be weekly, now it's every other week, in which, you know, we have my organization, ACLU, Office of Public Defender, is a statewide organization in which we realized, then this was due to COVID, look, we're going to have to get on the same page, or at least we're going to have to communicate with each other. And I think that actually helped, right? It really, really helped us. And even with, you know, we haven't necessarily focused on, you know, the direct actions, taking, you know, the recent direct actions in that. But I think that's definitely a solution that I will say, you know, you have a lot of organizations that are already in this space, right? That are already working on a lot of the different pieces. And for whatever reason, call it turf war, call it whatever, like just get on the same page, or at least have some type of, you're on Zoom anyway all day. Why not just join another Zoom call, right? To talk about a coordinated approach to a lot of this. I forgot what else I was gonna say. It'll come back to me. I forgot. It'll come back.
It's okay. If you remember it, just chime in.
Yeah, I'll add, and thank you for that, Iman. I'll add that, you know, and I think it's probably been said already, if I'm repeating it, forgive me, but I think it's worth repeating, that the overlapping challenges of COVID and the political dynamics that we're dealing with are telling, considering that pre-COVID, we were in an extremely dangerous space, that what we were dealing with were life-threatening situations, right? The policing situation was life-threatening. The issues around healthcare was life-threatening. Issues around housing was life-threatening. And so COVID exposed all of those things on a much more urgent kind of platform. And so the challenges, I think, became and still are overwhelming, where people need to respond to these things in real time, but we now have an additional pandemic on top of the need to respond to those things that make it somewhat difficult. But what I found to be heartening and to be hopeful is the creativity that people have tapped into to step up and create some answers in different spaces and ways. The level of mutual aid that we've seen across this country is absolutely inspiring. You know, people you never expected to step up have stepped up in real ways. People who you expected to step up didn't show up, right? So really looking at how community has been showing up, how people have decided that we cannot wait to wait for other people to do this. One of the refrains that's used not just in the movement for Black Lives, but in many other radical spaces is that who keeps us safe, we keep us safe. That we cannot rely on the state to provide any kind of safety, any kind of assurance, any kind of healthcare, any kind of services for our communities. That won't happen, right? That won't happen. And as we function from a principle of self-determination, we have to make sure that we're providing for ourselves. And this isn't anything new, right? Folks who have gone through our freedom struggle has had to deal with this dynamic for centuries, right? Jim Crow was always about that. You know, Reconstruction era was always about that. We had to create this new kind of infrastructure for us to provide for ourselves while simultaneously holding the state accountable for what they said that they would provide and they had never provided, right? So having this dual train of making sure we eat, but also calling to task the fact that you are trying to starve us. And so I think the creativity that people have manifested in making sure that we eat, making sure that our communities are safe, making sure that people have the PPE that they need, I think has been amazing. I think it's worthy of looking at and examining. And I think it will also be instructive as to how we need to move forward later, right? And so there are a number of other layers, I think, that will continue to compound on this. We just now entering in certain parts of the country, hurricane season, tornado season. I think we're going to be entering hurricane season soon. And so we know that within Hurricane Alley, our communities, Black communities, are going to be the ones that are going to have to deal with now 3 major issues, right? And so we know, again, that we're going to have to rely on ourselves to make sure that these things happen. So the lessons that we have learned is that we have, by nature of necessity, been able to provide the infrastructure to keep us safe. And, you know, I think subsequently it needs to be mentioned also that those are the same areas and some of the same organizations that continuously get underfunded. You know, this is an environment now where funders are saying, oh, we need to, you know, make sure we're investing in Black-led and Black-centered organizations. Yeah, but usually that means that the usual organizations are going to get it, the ones that are not having a real impact on the ground in some of these spaces, right? So, you know, I don't want to call names, but the major civil rights organizations are going to be the ones that are going to be getting the lion's share of these donations that are going to be coming in. Meanwhile, folks in New Orleans are going to continue to try to fight the police, continue to try to fight COVID, continue to try to fight the hurricanes, all of those things, and continue to put food on their tables, right? And so that reality, I think, forces us to recognize, again, that we don't have any choice but to continue to do what we have to do to keep our communities safe.
Thank you for sharing that. I think what we don't have a lot of time left, and I think there are 2 things that I sort of want to get at before we close out. There's a lot bubbling in the chat around like specific things that individual kinds of lawyers can do, and I think there's actually like, it's a bigger conversation about how to plug in on your local level. But I would love to hear from all of the panelists, just like, if you're thinking about your experience leading up to now, before the 2015 uprisings, even with this also, and just thinking about either your relationship with movement lawyers or you as a movement lawyer and what you've learned, like, what would you say to folks who are really hungry to get plugged in about some things that they should be thinking about or thinking about doing as we move into, you know, the next couple of months or weeks as this starts to, maybe uprisings aren't happening as often, or as Lumumba pointed out, we'll have other urgent things happening, whether more job loss, other things happening. So just lifting up, like, what do you think from your position folks can do or should be thinking about doing?
Mm-hmm. I can start and then I'll shut up from here. I think it's important to be able to answer the question to yourself, why? Why are you doing this? Like, what is your purpose for not just a profession, but if you are engaging this work from this particular profession, why? Right? Because I think that's going to answer a lot. And that why also should be attached to, well, what is your proximity to the issue that you are attempting to address? So this calls into task our identities, our racial identity, gender identity, class identity, nationality. All of these different things will really inform the why and the proximity. This is important because oftentimes people recognize lawyers, and I'm generalizing, you know, forgive me, but Lorenzo knows this. I give this speech quite often. You know, people who are lawyers oftentimes believe that the tool that they carry is the tool to fix everything, right? As an organizer who's not an attorney, and that people actually think I'm an attorney because I used to work at LDF, and I'm always moving with a bunch of other attorneys. But one of the biggest fights is to recognize that this is just one tool. Like, how do we make sure that this tool is working in coordination, not only with protests, not only with policy stuff, not only with boycott stuff, but all of the other tools that exist as we're trying to transform radically what our realities look like. We have to be really clear that this is just one tool. Effective if used correctly, dangerously ineffective if used incorrectly.
I agree with everything Lumumba said. One of the tensions that we have here is this tendency for lawyers to come into the work who aren't at all connected to movement. And while not being connected to movement, also holds sort of like this cult of criminal defense or civil rights advocacy as like almost like a faith, like a religion that is very rigid and also very self-serving. And what comes of that is a very obvious like schism between those lawyers and those of us who could be helpful to them if in fact they do want to effectuate change. It requires a certain amount of humility to admit that the law has never sparked or sustained a revolution, right? And so that level of like that reality check isn't one that's always welcome if folks are coming into the work hoping to get some sort of boost from it, where some if it's like a cathartic exercise for them. And so I would encourage people to identify organizations working on these issues and connect with them somehow. Right now, almost all of the organizations on the ground here are doing webinars, they're doing work to help people understand, what does it mean to defund the police? What is divest, invest, and all of those things. So connect with an organization because most of the time you're representing their base if you plan on coming to court, and then also be open to non-lawyer functions, be open to being willing to do some research and some writing, be willing to be the person that just sends the joint email from an organizer to someone else because someone needs to be in a room if you have access to those rooms. Those are the things in addition to signing up to represent. And I mentioned yesterday when talking to Ameca that we're trying to come up with like a know your rights thing for volunteer lawyers and for clients, because we're seeing things come up where people sign up for pro bono representation and they're being lured into contingency agreements for the civil matters that might stem from the criminal case. And so to the extent that we can support not only movement lawyering, but also protect our folks from predatory behaviors of lawyers, if you can be sort of the gatekeeper or the protector of community when your peers are behaving badly, I think that that's a really important way to perform some harm reduction.
I get this question a lot, and I don't know. Sometimes my answers, I just don't know, right? I tell it by telling my story. I responded to the call for legal people to help, and I never left. I stayed there after CNN left. I did a lot of things that attorneys don't do. I got to know people. I built a network, and I never left. I was consistent. I humbled myself. I relearned what my law degree should be doing. I learned the limits. I was very familiar with the limits of the law, and that allowed me to reimagine what it possibly could do. I was quiet when I should have been. I spoke up when, well, I always speak up even when I shouldn't, but that's the only way, right, that I can say, you know, how do I get involved? It doesn't look, I think, the way that we want it to look. And I'm sorry, my son is, it doesn't look the way that we want it to look sometimes. And what I mean by that is that sometimes it's not sexy work, right? It's not working on briefs and run into the process server, get your big, it's not that, right? It's sometimes it's work that you wouldn't imagine doing as a lawyer, but it needs to be done. And I think that, you know, somebody talked about, you know, the tool. For some reason, when you get your JD, people listen to you. I don't know why, because some of us should not be listened to, right? But people listen to us. And I realized that, you know, I was a Black woman coming into spaces with a law degree, and that was unique in and of itself sometimes. I like I said, I did a lot of things that, you know, a lot of other people didn't do. So I will say this, if you do want to get involved, this is not a 2-week thing. This is not a 4-week thing. You know what I mean? Like, dedicate yourself to it. Be consistent. And I get it. You know, not everyone has the ability to, you know, give a lot of hours, but whatever you do, yes, baby? Okay. But whatever you do, be consistent about it. And use your tools for good. And what I mean by that is, you know, if you know how to research, if you know, we definitely do need that a lot. But, you know, the only thing that I could say is, you know, in Law for Black Lives, they definitely have, you know, my organization, they have a list of organizations. Reach out to us. I get calls every day, I get emails every day, and I do respond to them. You know, but I am looking for folks to be consistent, right? I am looking for folks to, you know, be in it with me in a long haul. And I can't stress enough that this is more about relationships than anything. I don't even know if I gave the pointers that, you know, you all wanted to hear, but.
Yeah, I agree with everything everyone has said. I guess one thing, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of questions about, you know, like, who do we work with? Who do we show up for? I mean, one of the things about Facebook, Instagram, social media is that a lot of the organizing and the movement organizations are, you know, have a strong social media game. It's not that hard to figure out who's calling to defund and dismantle the prison industrial complex locally, who's calling to cancel rent, who's doing base building in working class communities, Black and brown communities, who's creating alternate accountability mechanisms that don't rely on the police, right? So we could try to collectively crowdsource like a list, you know, that's relevant today for a particular city to plug into. But the fact that a lot of us, and this was definitely true for me not, you know, that long ago, don't know where to show up or who to be in relation to, I think says something about the way how, you know, a lot of people, including lawyers, live our lives day to day, disconnected from the different ways that people come together in order to demand change, build community resiliency, do mutual aid, and so on and so forth. And so I think if you are feeling confused about who to show up for and where, you know, just like all of the other folks said, ask the question of why, ask the question of proximity. And I'd be happy to talk more extensively about that with, as a non-Black person of color who's been doing support in the BLM ecosystem for the last 4 or 5 years. Those are hard and important questions. Commit yourself to study, to reflection, think about what it means to show up in solidarity, be mindful about, we're all, you know, like to the extent that you have a job in an institution, whether it's legal aid, public defenders, I teach at a law school, like these are all institutions, even the social justice and public interest ones that perpetuate and sustain our unequal world, our anti-Black world, our capitalist system that extracts labor from the poor and hoards wealth for the wealthy. All of our institutions, or most of them, are fundamentally flawed. And of course, there's no kind of like pure option or pure job as a lawyer, legal worker, or a law student, but what it means to show up in solidarity to movements and communities in our day jobs is something that we could all spend more time prioritizing and thinking about, at the same time that we have a foot outside of our day jobs, our institutions, or whatever, and try to figure out how to how to move forward. And then I guess the last thing I'll say, really briefly, I'm seeing this question, hope for the future, question mark. I mean, I don't know, much about who's in the audience right now, but I'm 41, and as much, pain and grief is being mobilized and expressed in the streets in Columbus and around the country. To me, this also feels like an incredibly hopeful time where all of the organizing that Critical Resistance and Insight and Audre Lorde Project and on, even before that, all of the decades of organizing and the Black freedom movement and the anti-war movement and left, kind of social, like organizing of all sorts, we can feel all of that love and that work that people have put in for decades and decades. And we should all figure out how we can show up in ways that build the power of a radical vision for a better tomorrow, without prisons and police, where people have adequate housing and healthcare and food, and figure out how to sustain this movement, this fight to defund and abolish the police, to transform our country, or this country, or maybe make it disappear. All of those questions are on the table now in ways that are really hopeful. And I think we should all be participating in those conversations at our institutions, in our movements, and in our families and communities.
Wow, thank you for that, Amna. That was beautiful. And I do want to add to your, this point that you're making about this is not a moment, this is actually long-term work, and we should probably be thinking about how we're going to sustain the work of movement. I just want to add, there is a lot of interest at this moment. I know we have gotten a lot of requests to assist, as well as some requests for legal support. And one of the things that I can offer to this conversation is I called folks, I'm coming to you from New Orleans. I called some folks who were organizing actions for 8 days after, in solidarity with Minneapolis and other folks. And I called them and I said, hey, can I offer you something? Can I be of support or help to you as you're planning? And they basically said, not right now. We don't need your help right now. We have legal support on lock. If you wouldn't mind reconnecting with us in a month or so, that would be really dope. And I mean, that's what I plan to do, but I also lift that up to say, just to underscore the point that sometimes folks are going to tell you, I don't need your help right now, but they actually might need your help in a month or 2 months or 6 months. And it's important to keep checking in, not just in these moments where things are particularly urgent. Also, Iman, thank you for sharing your story. That was lovely and moving. And I do want to also just open it up to the rest of the panelists to talk about, to answer this question, hope for the future, or even to lift up a win that you are really inspired by from either where you are or around the country, something that's happened in the last couple of weeks or days that you're really feeling inspired by and sustained by.
I can say that I'm just really inspired by the 8 to Abolition campaign that was thrown up over the weekend. Micah Herskind is our new policy associate and started on the first day of quarantine with us. And obviously he was such a gift because of all of the knowledge that he brought with him to an office that is progressive, but obviously not as we are not able to walk out abolitionist reforms as in the ways that like are most ideal. So I'm really inspired about looking at the number of people who are willing to talk about prison abolition and what that looks like as compared to the little group of us who is like, 20 or 30 people meeting in different people's houses and basements and having to figure out how to frame campaigns in a way that didn't seem too threatening. It was like abolition, it was the subtext of everything. So I'm really inspired by the amount of research and information, especially young people have been able to like put out in accessible formats and are able to like change the minds and hearts of people who I had given up on. So I think that, for example, abandoning that $23 million allocation to the jail is just a testament to how quickly things can shift when you can get your hands on the narrative. So I'm really inspired by that.
I'm going to go really quickly because I have to jump off, but I will say there we have some young high school students here in Baltimore who are doing a direct action sometime this week, and they sent me their demands. And when I tell you, I could not have been more proud. They're calling for a more inclusive curriculum, calling for, they had a book list. I could not have been more proud. So I think, that was my little bit of sunshine and all of this. I shake my head a lot, but that was my sunshine, just reading the list of demands from these high school students. They just want to learn more, and they want the people who teach them to look like them. I want to learn. I know that my history is not what you're teaching me, and I want to learn more. And it was so inspirational and aspirational. If anything is, I think the youth, and need it. So, and if anyone has an inspirational story, send them to me because I need it these days. But good night.
Thank you, Iman. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your brilliance and just being here and offering words and thoughts to us.
Really briefly, what's inspiring me is the way that people are showing up for a lot of things, like getting 200 to 300 people on a webinar, or in Ohio State, where I live in Columbus, the student government presidents called for the university to cut ties with the Columbus Police Department. And within a matter of days, we had 20,000 people that signed it, faculty, staff, students, alumni, members of the community. And now we have a faculty letter that's out for signature. And like within, I think, a day or a day and a half, we had over 300 signatures, including a bunch of law professors. And for those of you who went to law school, imagining, like more than just me in my faculty signing that letter and then seeing those names come through is really kind of marking a shift in the moment. And so now, the question is the one we've all been posing, is how do we get people to deepen their commitment and their solidarity beyond signatures on a petition and donations to bail funds, which are obviously really important, but then kind of cultivate deeper shifts in how we relate to one another. So I'm excited for that work ahead and looking forward to building with all of you.
Thank you, Amna. Thank you for closing us out. I think we also lost Lumumba. I do just want to say that we got a couple of questions in the chat that I can answer offline for folks or work with our panelists to answer. We will be sending a follow-up email with some resources and any panelists that would like to offer their contact information. We'll also include that there. I do want to just answer this question. Someone asked a question of like, how do non-movement lawyers, put their toe in the water and really start to get to work and get to understanding how to do this work, and are there organizations or resources? And Law for Black Lives is a place where you can come to for that. We offer all kinds of trainings and resources to lawyers who are interested in incorporating principles of movement lawyering, or at least trying to incorporate principles of movement lawyering into their practice as an individual lawyer and also in their organizations. Many folks on the call I see we have been in conversation with for the past couple of years about how we do this on the ground in the place that you are at. So if you are interested in that kind of information, you want to talk more about it, you can always send us an email, send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat box. We'll, like I said, send this webinar out to everyone who signed up. And hopefully we'll continue this conversation over the next couple of months. And if you want to see something or you want to hear more about something as it relates to how you show up and how you can learn more about movement lawyering, we got you. We're here. And with that said, I think we're going to close out. Thank you everyone for being here with us. Thank you for taking time out of your evening, and look for the email that has the information here that we shared here and the recording. I just put my email on the, oh, I didn't put my email in the inbox. Hold on. I'm about to do that now. I'm going to share my email in the inbox. Also, you can hit the info at Law for Black Lives. You can go to our website. There are multiple ways to contact us. So please feel free to reach out. And that's it. Have a good night, y'all.